Well, thank you so much, Emily Horowitz and Athena Devlin, for having me back. It's very flattering to be kicking off the Perspectives on American Politics and Policies series here, and to be here again. Last year when I came here, it was really just one of the best audiences I've ever spoken to. Both the young punks in the back and the old punks in the front. And it's really great to be back here. And I look forward to the Q&A. I do want to tout a few of the speakers you have coming here in this terrific series. My friend Debbie Nathan is here on October 3rd. She's one of the smartest people I know. Very savvy veteran journalist. Very, very savvy. She's now working for the ACLU, monitoring things on the US-Mexico border. She's a fluent Spanish speaker. She's got a lot of stories to tell, and she's someone who cuts right to the heart of things very quickly. So I highly recommend that. Marty Tankleff, not someone I've ever met, but someone I follow on Twitter, will be talking about false confessions and being wrongfully convicted and exonerated. He's a heroic criminal defense attorney, and his own personal experience in the subject is a story that will keep you up at night. So I'm warning you, or promising you, that if you go hear him talk, what he tells you about, you'll probably lose sleep over. But it's a story that I think people should hear. So I highly recommend that. We've got a lot of other great speakers too. Last year I spoke about Chase Madar, the young soldier and US military whistleblower responsible for the largest leak of classified information in US history. Things were looking pretty bleak a year ago for Chase Madar, but that story has taken quite a sudden twist, as one of my front row students already pointed out, and maybe we'll touch on that later. But the subject that I want to talk about today is the overuse of criminal law and its institutions, police, prosecutors, and prisons, as the primary tool of achieving social order in the United States. You see in the news more and more about police shootings of unarmed people in the United States, from Philando Castile in Minnesota, Michael Brown. There are less famous cases too. I think about my Facebook friend Michael Bell in Kenosha, Wisconsin, whose son was shot point blank in the head at a DUI stop right outside his own home. And Michael Bell, the father, is finally getting some justice there. You may know that we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, despite all our self-regard of the United States being the freest country in the world, the land of the free, and all that. But we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and much higher than peer countries in Europe and Canada, Australia. I think it's sometimes very important to kind of hit the ideological mute button on what any nation is saying about itself and just look at the cold facts. And there are many indexes and measures of freedom, but I think surely the most important one is how many people are getting locked up and how many people are not free there. And we're doing just an abysmal job there. But in a way, these are just the tip of the iceberg, police shootings and mass incarceration. And I want to talk about some big strategic uses of criminal law for achieving social order, where there are whole other tools and strategies that would be much more effective, that already are much more effective in other parts of the world, even in other parts of the United States, and where we need to think about entire strategic alternatives to using police, prosecutors, and prisons. It's back to school season now, so we can start out with schools. And by the way, since I know we're getting back in a groove, anytime someone wants some caffeine or some cookies, please go right up ahead, even if I'm, in the middle of something.
If you come in late, spend 5 minutes getting coffee.
Yeah, that's fine, We have more and more schools in the United States outsourcing their discipline to police personnel. Now, all schools need some kind of discipline, need a kind of positive order in a school. Otherwise, you can't have learning going on if there's chaos, if there's some violence. But there are different ways to achieve a kind of social order in a school. And the way we're increasingly doing this by putting in metal detectors and police personnel who are not beholden to either the teachers or even the principal, but only to themselves, is really, I think, a wrong way to do it. There's been a huge spike in federal funding for school police after the Columbine high school shooting and massacre in 1999. Most of this federal funding that's been plowed into more police personnel and metal detectors for schools has gone into working class urban schools with mostly Black and Latin students. And this is a way kind of a toxic irony, because the Columbine high school shooting, this was at a public high school in an upper middle class, very white, affluent high school. And the response to that seems to be more punishment, more punitive measures in majority non-white urban working class schools. How fair is that? But racist inequality is one of the major themes, really the biggest theme that you see in American criminal justice and the overdose of criminal punishment that we suffer from today. And by the way, Columbine, despite having this massacre in 1999, still hasn't installed metal detectors at this school. And that's not due to some oversight or slow moving. It's because that community doesn't want metal detectors. The parents of the high school kids there do not want their kids to start the day being treated like potential criminals. And because they're upper middle class suburbanites, they have the political clout to get their way. And they're aware of alternatives, which is not always the case in working class urban non-white neighborhoods. Now, the big lie about school security that really sets my teeth on edge is that, well, it may be tough to throw police in school and have metal detectors, but there's no alternative. In fact, there are plenty of alternatives. And I investigated one set of alternatives that are flourishing here in New York City in high schools, in our public high schools, not just at the magnet schools like Stuyvesant and Bronx Science, but at neighborhood schools in working class parts of the city. And I'm a co-author of this report, Safety with Dignity, written with the New York Civil Liberties Union. I wrote it when I was co-authored it when I was a staff attorney at Make the Road, New York. But what I found were about half a dozen high schools with students who came from the same working class, very high poverty demographic, and schools that did a great job with school discipline without police and without metal detectors. And it turns out these schools that achieved discipline and social order without police and metal detectors got much better educational results too. Lower truancy, higher four-year graduation rates. Now, like everything in social science, this is more of suggestive than a mathematical proof, and you can find differences between, the school groups that we studied. But I think it still shows that there are real alternative models possible here in New York, in fact, that are already flourishing. And think about, what kind of school would you like to go to? One where you get patted down every single morning, like a security line? Would you like your kids or grandkids to go to such a school? Or would you like to go to a school where people are treated with some dignity and treated like responsible people capable of mature decision making? If you treat people a certain way, there's a high chance that they're going to wind up acting that way, whether you treat them as reprobates and potential criminals, or like responsible young people who have some learning to do, Lord knows, but are capable of exercising some autonomy and responsibility. So look that up if you like. I mean, there are plenty of solutions to the school to prison pipeline flourishing all around us, and that's what really should be the model in New York City and elsewhere. Not the kind of theatrical slapping in more metal detectors, pouring more money into school police. Drugs is something else that would benefit in this country from taking a totally different approach, okay? Right now, our approach to illegal drug use and narcotic use is overwhelmingly punishment-oriented. Police, prisons, and even the reform measures that are now getting touted occasionally, drug courts, drug treatment programs in prisons are still being floated as part of the criminal justice system. What we need here, as in so many other places, is not just a softening of the criminal justice system, but an entire paradigm shift and an entire transfer of both budget and authority from law enforcement to other branches of government that can deal with these problems and social order in a better way. Now, the role of drug crimes in the United States is often exaggerated. It's true that the war on drugs has really been a scourge and caused a lot of misery, but only about 17% of total state prisoners in the US are in for nonviolent drug crimes. And that's a lot lower than many people tend to think, both liberals and conservatives. So even though it's a smaller piece than you might have heard or that we might imagine, it's still a very important piece. I mean, 17% of our huge incarcerated population is still a very big chunk. Are there any available models that we can turn to for looking for a totally different approach for dealing with drug use that's not criminal justice focused? The answer is yes. Okay. I went to Portugal a couple of times at the end of 2015 to study the Portuguese model in drug decriminalization. They did not legalize all drugs there, but they did decriminalize drugs. And this was in response to a heroin epidemic that had really ravaged the country at every level, you know, from working class to the very rich to the middle class, immigrants, native Portuguese. And there was a huge groundswell to just try something different because locking people up was not working. So what they decided to do in Portugal was to stop spending money on these carceral, these prison solutions, and to transfer a lot of budget and authority into drug treatment programs that are not a part of the justice system. So now what happens if you're caught with drugs in Portugal, if you're caught with below a threshold amount, and it's very strictly measured. If it's like 20 kilos of heroin, then they figure, okay, you're a major drug trafficker and we need to call in the police. But if it's for personal use, then you get written a little ticket about where you can go in to meet the Ministry of Health. And you go there on your own free will, and most people choose to do that. And if you don't go, well, maybe you'll go the next time. And people in Portugal have found that this works much better by transferring government budget into drug treatment in a way that's totally separate from the justice system. Now, they haven't solved all their drug problems. I don't think any modern society is going to. But the ability of people to get methadone treatment in a non-punitive setting makes a huge difference. And I hear occasionally people say, well, what's the difference? Methadone or heroin, it's like being addicted to one drug or instead of another. In fact, there's a huge difference. If you're getting regular methadone treatment and showing up once a day to get your little Dixie cup cocktail with the right dosage, you can maintain a job, you can maintain, regular relationships with your family, your spouse, and continue to have a life that's not chaotic, that is less likely to involve homelessness. That's a lot harder to do for people who are on heroin. For a variety of reasons. And people in Portugal have found that they think, anyway, that their model has worked very well. And the issue is now completely depoliticized. From the left-wing parties to the right-wing political parties in Portugal, that's something that no one wants to change anymore. And, I talk about Portugal sometimes, and one response I get is, well, that's like apples and oranges. Portugal's different from the United States. And yeah, of course, we're different countries, different histories, different issues. But apples and oranges, whenever I hear that, I think, yeah, two fruits of approximately similar size, shape, price, nutritional value. What better to compare than apples and oranges? And I think given how bad our criminal justice system, the amount of needless misery we inflict on people in the United States, we need to start looking for alternatives in other countries and within our own country with the same sense of urgency that people look for habitable planets in science fiction movies, when the Earth is running out. So it is high time to look to other countries too. This American exceptionalism, this idea that we have nothing to learn from any other country, that's a form of brain cancer. And you really have to, we all have to get over that. That's not saying that you can transplant instantly a model from another country. Of course, it would have to be adapted to our own unique national circumstances. There's no doubt about that. And that could be very challenging and difficult sometimes. But we still have plenty to learn from other countries. And Portugal's one of them with their, the way they've successfully decriminalized drugs. And there's some real opportunities now that, I mean, I hate to like put a happy face on the opioid crisis in this country, which is killing so many people, especially young people. It started out with prescription opioids, moved to heroin, and is now moving to fentanyl, where we have an epidemic of overdose deaths. But I hope this is causing people to reconsider the punitive approach. We're certainly not there yet. So far, in response to the opioid crisis in this country, although there has been, you know, a bit more talk about non-punitive approaches, talk is only talk. The third biggest state in our country, Florida, just passed a whole new raft of mandatory minimum sentences related to opioids. And although they're punitively aimed at dealers, the distinction between dealers and users when it comes to opioids, heroin, fentanyl is often fairly meaningless. Someone who's a dealer might be a user who gets a little extra, wants to make $20 by giving a friend a dose. And so you've got to be aware of these, you know, these measures that are supposedly only targeting dealers, because so much of our war on drugs that's punished so many people needlessly has been framed that way. Mental illness is another area where we need to take police out of and find other tools to deal with. Now, dealing with mental illness is a challenge in any country, in every civilization. That's something that's not going away. And I'm not, you know, trying to promise you that there's just an easy peasy way to do it that resolves everything instantly. That's just inherent in, I think, any civilization. But we could definitely use a better set of problems that we have than we have now, where so often the encounters between mentally ill people and police lead at the very least to arrests needlessly, and the very worst to, you know, police killing someone because they don't know how to deal with a mentally ill person, which is a special skill that requires real training and a real sense of calling even. And I think about Tanisha Anderson, killed by police without a gun in my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio. They were just responding to a call, and she didn't respond well to being hustled into the backseat of the car, and the police slammed her head against the curb, and that killed her several years ago. Now, one city that I've been to that's made very important progress in this area is Memphis, Tennessee, where about a year and a half ago I did a ride-along with one of their crisis intervention teams. These are police who have special training there to deal with people who have a mental illness, very often combined with a drug problem. And Memphis developed this program in response to a police shooting of a mentally ill person that was so nasty and egregious that even the Memphis police said, whoa, we really need to do things differently. And they brought in some people from the local university, a psychologist, and developed a new toolkit and a new technique that is now a national model and even an international model. And you know, you have police officers there are hand-selected for this program to get special training, hand-selected for the kind of personality they have, you know, their abilities. Not all police are really capable of doing this. And even the police dispatchers are trained because there's a lot of repeat business, frequent flyers, they're called, in psychiatric hospitals there. People get to know who the population is that is, you know, requiring repeat business. And this has led to arrest rates plummeting in Memphis. And that's a very good thing. This is on the front end of the whole criminal justice process. There's a whole special door at one of the public hospitals in Memphis for people who are being brought in by the police, and there's no arrest involved, and it's just a much better way to deal with this. Now, I don't think it's really the end point. I think that's the first step, but I think ideally the end point is to have civilian teams, crisis intervention teams that are not police personnel at all. And I think that's the next step for Memphis and for the rest of the country too, where civilian teams that can call in police backup if they really need it, but to just completely de-policify it. And getting there and figuring it out is a challenge. It's a practical challenge, but I think it can be done. Another area that I want to talk about is poverty and debt, the criminalization of poverty and debt. DEBT in this country is a huge disaster right now. Now, when I was in 9th grade, we read Charles Dickens, read Great Expectations, and when learning about Victorian England, one of the things we were taught is they had debtors' prisons there. They locked people up simply for being in debt. How cruel and barbaric and hypocritical they were in Victorian England. And now you hear the adjective Dickensian to talk about that kind of harshness. Well, we have that in the United States now. And they usually aren't called debtors' prisons, but you have that creeping along through a variety of means. For instance, in Arkansas, if you get behind in your rent, then you can be criminally charged for robbing your landlord. And the police can charge you and pick you up right there in housing court. Is that really the best way to deal with people getting behind in their rent with the lack of affordable housing, criminalizing that? Court fees for minor offenses are often more and more fobbed off onto low-income people who can't afford them, whose offense very often has to do with their poverty and either living in public or spending a lot of time in public spaces. These things should not be part of the criminal justice system. Medical debt often gets criminalized too, or can be. Immigration, has been in the news a lot, with DACA apparently about to get destroyed by Trump and the Republican Congress, with some Democratic approval too. We need to think about ways to regulate our borders that do not involve punishment, and think about a whole set of tools that have atrophied, where it could be much more effective than throwing people in detention camps, than creating 100-mile zones away from the U.S. border, whether either coast or the north or southern border, in which about 2/3 of the country lives, where people's constitutional rights are seriously abridged. Do we really want an expansion of police power, of ICE agents, of local police working as kind of deputized federal immigration? That comes at a huge cost in civil liberties for all Americans. And needless to say, it comes at more than a cost to the millions of undocumented people in the United States. And all countries regulate their borders in some way, but there's a way to use trade policy in Central America, macroeconomic policy, to diminish the pull and the demand and the push of immigrants searching for a livelihood than we have now, and taking money out of funding a runaway police state and put that money into other measures. Now, a lot of people find that funding things like trade or macroeconomic projects or labor-intensive economic aid is somehow less satisfying than punishment. But I question the morality of that. There's a whole set of tools aside from punishment, aside from punishing people, that we need to look at immigration as well as mental illness, drugs, and schools. So I could go further. The over-criminalization of sex is an important topic too, and that's something that Emily Horowitz has written about, and you have some speakers that are going to talk about that important issue too. And it's not a false dichotomy between anything goes whatsoever and the kind of status quo we have now, where we're labeling more and more people sex offenders and being harshly punitive. I mean, should an 18-year-old who sends a sext or a nude picture to a 16-year-old girlfriend be branded as a sex offender for life? I think not. I think there are much better ways. All societies find ways to regulate sex, whether through taboos, incentives, rewards, peer pressure, but we're relying more and more on the criminal justice system to do that. And I think that's a horrible mistake. So how do we get out of this overuse of criminal law? More and more people, conservatives, liberals, radicals, Black Lives Matter, and a lot of, white people, we're realizing that we've gone way too far and are relying far too much on the punitive state power to maintain social order in this country. So how do we get out of it? I think one thing that we need to be aware of is pseudo reforms. Reforms that seem like they're a nice step in the right direction, but if you look at them, they're really just an expansion of police power. Any reform that is increasing police budget or the punitive budget in a prison or prison system or the prosecutor's office is probably a bad idea. Again, sometimes I think you need to hit the ideological mute button and just look at the size of budgets. If you keep pouring money into police departments, prosecutors' offices, the courts in general, and prisons, you're really expanding the scope of their power, no matter what kind of nice rhetoric is being attached to it. So I'm a little wary of any reform that's all about more training or more police diversity. That can be a good thing, but the amount of impact that it generates is surprisingly low. A lot of reform-oriented conferences that I go to are very fixated on police body cameras, like this magic new gadget that if we attach it to police, suddenly we're going to have wonderful policing and police accountability. That turns out not to be the case. Like, police can turn off the body cameras. You very often don't see what the actual police officer is doing because it's being filmed out of them, not at them. So I think there's no technological quick fix here. I think what we need, again, to repeat, is big strategic shifts of budget and authority away from the criminal justice system and into other branches of government that can deal with some of these issues in social order without, locking people up or punishing them. This is going to take a long time. I think that the project to reform American criminal justice and bring it into line with other peer countries is really a generational effort that's going to require a lot of people, a lot of different kinds of people, not just the young and the old, but a lot of conservatives, Republicans, not to mention liberals, radicals, Black Lives Matter activists and sympathizers, and even people who aren't fully on board with that. Institutions have a very hard time shrinking, and the police are no exception to that. Institutions, whether it's a private company or a government institution, always want to grow and expand. Now, I asked at a conference about a year ago, the police chief of Camden, New Jersey, an impoverished American city with a lot of law and order issues there, do you really think that police are the best social institution to deal with mental illness? Since the guy was just saying that was a lot he had to deal with. And he said, oh no, if you can't medicate it, incarcerate it. That's our motto. And he didn't say that in a nasty way. He just said that in a very weary way. But since we don't have funding for mental health treatment, drug treatment being handled by appropriate organizations, this is dumped on the police. Now, at the same time, would he be willing to let go of 25% of his department's budget to be, shifted into the Department of Health? Probably not. But that's why we need strict public control, and we need to be very politically minded in how we deal with the police. We should all remember that the police work for us, and society does not exist for the good of police. Police exist for the good of society. That's how it's supposed to work anyway. But we need to think about big paradigm shifts. And another thing that I'm very skeptical of that I think falls short of this paradigm shift is people talk about we need more drug courts. and drug treatment programs, but inside prisons. Well, why not have drug treatment available outside the prison? That's not a part of the criminal justice system. And drug courts, the appropriate police response to an 18-year-old who gets caught smoking a joint on a park bench, I think, is nothing. Okay? Nothing. And you may not like that, but the price of living in a free society is occasionally dealing with some minor inconveniences. And the cost that we've inflicted on so much of our people in this country is incarceration and misery and needless punishment. But thinking outside the box entirely of criminal justice is where we want to go. There's a good recent article in the website Injustice Today, injusticetoday.com. I highly recommend it. It's a lot of good local reporting, in-depth analysis from around the country about the criminalization of poverty through slapping fines and even criminal charges on people for fare beating in the United States, or in New York for turnstile jumping. And instead of spending money and limited government resources on criminal charges and processing people through the system, which costs money, and even instead of slapping civil fines on people, why not invest all that money into subsidizing fares so people can afford it? The MTA's fare prices keep going up and up. Why not make transportation, which people depend on to get a job, more affordable? We really need to think about massive strategic shifts of resources that way, and just to transplant it root and branch away from the criminal justice system into other branches of government that would do a much better job of dealing with it. So I just want to finish today with some show and tell, because we're in the middle of a real explosion of important writing and thinking and really radical rethinking of the criminal justice system in the United States. And barely a month goes by without some important new book or several that are addressing these issues. Two I want to start out with are Chokehold by Paul Butler and Locking Up Our Own by James Foreman Jr., two very smart law professors who have worked in the system. James Foreman Jr. as a public defender in Washington, D.C. Paul Butler is a federal prosecutor who was also a defendant in a criminal case once due to false charges from an apparently mentally ill neighbor. He's written about that. But Chokehold is a former prosecutor's radical thoughts on how to disrupt the system. It's focusing on the way black men, who have the highest incarceration rate of any ethnic and gender group in the United States. It's what's called an intersectional approach. Intersectional has gotten to be kind of a buzzword, but I think it still has some real use too when used appropriately. And it's a great book about the way the criminal justice system has this, maybe what he calls a chokehold on black men in America, and how even well-intentioned, race-neutral, and some race-specific methods aimed at black men have failed. And he's someone who, he's open to solutions, but he cuts through the too easy answers very quickly. And he's a very good writer, and it's a very important book. Locking Up Our Own is all about Washington, D.C., which now has a higher incarceration rate than any state in the union. It's not exactly a fair comparison. Washington, D.C., it's a city, and like many American cities, it's high poverty, a lot of concentrated poverty, which means a higher crime rate. But it's still noteworthy that this city, with the majority black population, has enacted many of the harsh measures that you see in majority white places. And anyone know who James Foreman Jr.'s father was? James Foreman Sr., yes. But James Foreman Sr. was a leader of the civil rights movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But he writes very, very well about the horrible dilemmas faced by politicians in Washington, D.C., where they wanted kind of an all-of-the-above approach to fighting high crime in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. But things like investing more money into full employment, for people, so people have jobs and income, investing money into good mental health care, drug treatment, these were not really available. They were off the political menu, which only left harsher and harsher criminal justice measures. And that's why even DC has become a very punitive place. You can find my review of these two books in the latest issue of Book Forum, bookforum.com. You can read it on your telephone. We really need to look elsewhere for solutions too, for models that we can adapt to our own national circumstances. This is a brand new book by Mark Howard. He's a childhood friend of Marty Tankleff, who's coming to speak here. This is all about comparative perspectives, looking at the middle and back end of American punishment, things like prosecutions, plea bargains, sentencing, rehabilitation, prison conditions, and parole, comparing the United States to peer countries like Germany, Canada, Australia, France, the United Kingdom. And you can really see, what we have to learn, how other countries manage to have an incarceration rate that's just a tiny fraction of ours. 1/10, 1/4, and how much farther we have to go. But very important research there. This book by my old friend Tanya Ertzen, God in Captivity, is a terrific book. It's about the rise of faith-based prison ministries in the age of mass incarceration. And right now, for many people in prison, the only kind of education or programs that they can get access to better themselves, stay sane, are religious. There's in much of the South and in the upper Midwest, that's all there is. What does that mean? We're a very religious country compared to other rich countries. What's the connection between American religiosity and American punishment? And she investigates that. She found people who think that mass incarceration is a good thing because only by cutting people down and humbling people can people find God. I find that to be a very kind of perverted interpretation of Christianity. I mean, I'm a godless atheist myself, but I still care about that. And religion is a powerful force in our country. And let me plug the American Studies program here for a bit, because when we're looking at the huge problem of American punishment and how extreme it is, we need to take a full spectrum approach. Cultural, looking at religion, looking at the law, looking at the politics, looking at race. And it should also be numerate too. I mean, a cultural approach and a numerate approach are very complementary. And newspapers, not just the New York Post, but even the New York Times, get away with all kinds of scarifying mischief by abusing statistics and taking numbers out of context. And our current commander-in-chief, bless his heart, does that all the time, and so does our National Attorney General. So it's important. Part of being an educated person is understanding the culture, but also being able to understand the numbers and cutting through that, so you're not fooled by the attempts to spread fear, panic, and hysteria. And one last book that I'd like to tell you about, I don't have a copy with me, is by John Paff, who teaches law at Fordham. It's called Locked In, and it's about looking at the power of prosecutors. This is something that's very understudied and still poorly understood. The power of local prosecutors, who are all elected, and their power to make a county incredibly punitive or a bit less punitive too. In New York State, we're about 30% down from our peak number of incarcerated people. That's a significant change, and John Paff thinks it's mainly because prosecutors in just a handful of counties in the state have backed off and realized that throwing so many people in prison is just an evil thing to do, not a good thing to do. John Paff is someone who is really into data and crunches numbers really well. There's a lot of empirical investigation there, but he doesn't lose sight of the big picture and get lost in detail. So I highly recommend that book, Locked In, to take out of the Brooklyn Public Library, buy a copy, take it from the school library. I want to point out on the note of prosecutors that there is a primary election for registered Democrats and Republicans today in Brooklyn that will decide who the next prosecutor of Kings County is. And these prosecutor elections are incredibly important, and a lot more people are discovering this, that this is a weak spot in the punitive system, where if people go in there and show up to vote, you can make real change happen on the local level. Most of American punishment in criminal justice is done at the local and state level. So even with Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump in Washington, I don't think the push for serious reform is going to be restrained or held up that much, and that's good news. But take a look at what one group called Five Borough Defenders has done. They've made a report card for all the DA candidates and the primary ticket in Brooklyn and graded them. And if from a reform point of view, the people who score the best are Mark Fleidner and Ann Swern. And take a look at that, take your choice. But if you're a registered Democrat, I highly recommend you go to the polls today and vote. And make up your own mind. I'm not endorsing any candidate. So that's it. Shall we open it up to Q&A?
Yes, thank you.
This issue, as I've framed it today, really came to my mind was about 2005, when I was working as a staff attorney in Bushwick. And the community organization that I was part of, Make the Road New York, had a relationship with local high school, with one of the several schools in this former large high school. And it was about school security, where I was told, and I got complaints from students, a teacher, and even an assistant principal at this school about the metal detectors and the school safety agents, as they're euphemistically called, in New York. And they were all saying, yeah, it's a huge hassle and it adds no safety because you only have the metal detector and this security guards at the front entrance. But there are plenty of other doors to the school. And any kid with the slightest bit of imagination could get something through there if they wanted to. I mean, I'd say like 4 out of 5 times. And yet they still had this. And there was, and one of the youth members of this organization had gotten handcuffed in plastic cuffs. And I'm not one of these weirdos who thinks all teenagers are just wonderful. But this kid was really nice. She was very mild-mannered. And I'm like, what possible reason could there be to handcuff this, I think she was about 16, for being late to class? Or, I mean, something is profoundly wrong if that's how you're dealing with school discipline. I mean, you're not creating order that way. You're creating a kind of pressurized, nasty disorder. And I would have hated to be treated that way.
I actually asked the question before.
Yeah, no, thanks for that cluster of questions. Let me try to answer them en masse. No, that's good. Starting with, I mean, we should acknowledge and face head on that there was a huge increase in crime in the United States, starting in the early 60s, peaking in the early 90s. And often, left liberal reformer types try to avoid that. And I think part of the huge increase in punishment that we had was a response to that. I don't think it was the right response. I think that huge spike in crime explains to a large degree, but doesn't justify the hyper-punitive response that's still mostly in place. Now, is there any progress or opportunity? I mentioned that New York State's were about 30% down in terms of peak incarceration rate. I think our incarceration rate in a total pop in New York State is still much higher than it should be. So I'm not saying everything's dandy. But yeah, things have moved. And in part, that's because you have, sorry, someone's calling me. I'm trying to shut it off in my pocket. In part because prosecutors at the county level, mostly in New York, but also in Albany, have started doing things a little differently. They need to do things a lot differently. Bail reform is big. New Jersey just passed a bail reform measure. That's big. Every other state should too. You have, it's really come to the fore. I think there's room for optimism. One thing that makes me optimistic is Philadelphia just had an election for district attorney. and the primary was back in April or May. And the guy who won it, after a lot of political organizing, is some guy who's genuinely different from what came before. A career criminal defense attorney who sued the Philadelphia police 75 times. His name is Larry Krasner. I recommend looking up Larry Krasner. And that's like a night and day difference. Some cities like Chicago and Cleveland, you've had new DAs get elected that are maybe slightly less bad than what came before. But in Philly, you have a very stark difference. And I'd look into that. I think this is, again, like a generational effort. And the war on crime is not going to end in Washington with some big ceremony, with some like peace treaty signed aboard an aircraft carrier or anything like that. Because law enforcement and criminal justice in the US is a very local issue, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of small local victories. It would be nice to get some help from Washington for this, which we're certainly not getting now. But it's the local level is where the real action is. When we're talking about our sky-high incarceration rate and what are the cultural reasons behind it, it's tempting to reach immediately for the big guns and these huge issues that have been part of American history. I think the three biggest ones are slavery and violently enforced white supremacy in all its forms, single biggest one, being a settler colonial state that conquered this country westward. And we like to think of ourselves as a country of immigrants, but we're also a country of petty conquistadors. And also a puritanical streak in our religion that's very much about cutting people down rather than people getting elevated. But we should recognize, too, that just 40 years ago, our incarceration rate, although it was higher than in Northern Europe and Canada, it wasn't astronomically higher. 40 years ago, our incarceration rate was 200 and something per 100,000. Now it's almost 700 per 100,000. So it's gone way up, but a lot's happened just in the past 40 years, where we were on the high end back 40 years ago. Now we're of a completely aberrant. So I think that we should look at cultural issues, but also recognize they're contingent political issues too. Am I making sense? And look how, and those, of course, contingent political changes of the past 40 years, they're informed by these cultural baselines that we have ongoing in our country. They're not completely removed from each other. But I think we should handle both culture and recent political changes with some sensitivity and not just say, oh, well, we're just forever a damned nation because of the sins of our ancestors. Well, 40 years ago, things looked pretty different. It looked like our incarceration rate was going down, and we weren't that aberrant. So we can look at the criminal justice system and at the whole process of it as having like three phases. The front end, which is about police contacts and what happens before people get arrested. That's what I've focused on today. It's kind of like preventive medicine. Before people might even get arrested, how are we achieving social order? Can we do it without cops, without criminal law? Or as opposed to now, where it's more and more everything is policified. And I concentrate on that because I think it's the most important. Now, what you've talked about is also very important about kind of the middle, where people are prosecuted and in court. And just a few, reformist ideas that are catching on in different places. One is bail reform that the gentleman in the back brought up. That can get a lot of people out of jail, county jail. Very important. And I think there's a lot of wind in the sails there. Jury nullification is something that Paul Butler has written about a lot. And I recommend looking into what he's written. One very important thing that the federal government could do, and state governments too, is just more money for public defenders. Public defenders are extremely overworked and overextended, and it's just impossible to do a really good job if you have too many clients as a lawyer. And I taught at Wallkill Correctional Facility last semester, and a lot of my students complained about the public defenders they had. They have very good reason to complain. They didn't get the amount of attention and work that their cases deserve. But I also feel bad for the public defenders who are doing the best they can, but they're underfunded. But pouring more money into that doesn't even have to be a ton to just kind of level the playing field right now. Because right now, prosecutors are holding all the good cards and have all the power. So I mean, those are some reform ideas for the middle of the system. And then there's the end of the system, prison conditions. Is there real rehabilitation? What's parole like? I think by the time you're talking about that, I don't want to say it's too late, but I want to concentrate more on the front end.
They're not going to keep the best ever.
I think what you're saying is a lot of this is supply side, that if you build more prisons or fund, then they're going to create their own business. And I've heard that about ICE agents doing immigration enforcement, that you have so much money going into ICE that they're just looking for things to do now and getting up to all kinds of mischief. So I think, that's what I'm saying. The best kind of reform is at the very front end where you're taking budget and authority away from the criminal justice system and transferring it to the Department of Health, Department of Education, and things like that, public jobs program, so people can be fully employed. That in the end is the most stable and lasting solution. I don't think hiring more public defense attorneys, public defenders would necessarily make for more defendants. There, I'm not sure if the supply side logic holds. But when you say if you build more prisons, they're going to keep them full.
No, I said
Yeah.
more prisons, but
The way that's happened now in New York State is you have many prisons that are still open, but they have significantly fewer inmates than before. So it hasn't worked out. But what you do have is that the payroll of corrections officers and all that is still just what it used to be. So, there's one argument that you frequently hear from more on the conservative side, that the reason we need to, incarcerate fewer people is we'll save money. Well, it doesn't work out that way. We're in New York State, for example, even though we're 30% off our peak incarceration, we are still paying the same amount of money for it. You don't get a 30% saving. The only way to really save money from less incarceration is to shut down entire prisons, or like a whole wing of a prison. Otherwise, the overhead costs and the prison guard unions are powerful players in Albany and in other state capitals. They keep it going. So, what you say has real validity there. No, it's a good question. And we should all develop a nose for pseudo reforms that are, rebranding, as you say, or euphemizing punishment by calling it something else. I'm not familiar with this precise federal, program that you mentioned, but I will point out, because it's not that well known, and it should be, that the federal percentage of total prisoners in the U.S. is quite low. It's only about 13% of total prisoners in the U.S. are federal prisoners. We need to make sure that instead of ending and limiting the carceral state, we're doing that rather than expanding it and kind of diffusing it, into, programs that sound nice, that are diversion, but if you miss one, then you're back in the system. The technical term for this, which you may well know, is called net widening, where under the guise of softening the criminal justice system, you're really casting a wider net, capturing more people. And now if a 16-year-old gets busted for smoking a joint, they have to go to a mandatory drug treatment. And if they skip one, they face a real penalty in the criminal justice system. That's not a reform. That's an expansion of of policing, an expansion of punishment. And we need to be on the lookout for that. The best medicine here is going to be preventive, where instead of funding, youth prisons and youth prosecutions to, strategically transfer all that budget to youth centers, rec centers, youth employment and mentoring programs, that kind of thing, so that young people can have other opportunities, apart from just being in the criminal justice system. That's easier said than done, of course, but I think that's the only true direction that we should be pushing in. What you bring up, though, is a huge problem, and that's the corrosive effect on family life and community life that our overweening police state is having, and that mass incarceration is having. And it's, the whole idea of policing is that it's supposed to help the social order and protect communities from chaos. But when policing and prisons reach a certain point, and we're well past that point, it's really shredding the social fabric. When you have, neighborhoods where a lot of the usually men are missing, a lot of the fathers, sons, brothers. And that's very bad for community life. And that makes it very much harder for that neighborhood or community to organize effectively against these harsh criminal justice measures. Dorothy Roberts is a law professor who's written beautifully about this. I recommend her work, Dorothy Roberts, a very great scholar. And there's a really bitter irony in this, because 30 years ago, groups like the ACLU were seen as, well, they just care about the individual rights of criminals. What about the community? Well, we've seen that the barely checked ferocity of our criminal justice system is really the true threat to many communities across the United States and to social life, family life. Children with an incarcerated parent are much more likely to wind up in foster care or in a group home than children without an incarcerated parent. And once kids are in that system, they're much more likely to be picked up by the criminal justice themselves. I mean, normal teenage misbehavior in a household is probably not going to lead to criminal charges, but it's a lot more likely to if it's in a group home or some kind of state custodial setting. So it creates this horrible cycle. And the threat to family life is, I think, not emphasized enough from our overweening police state.
So thank you so much.
Thank you all.